this week's podcast in English.com, we're talking about a phrase that we hear often nowadays, the new normal. So what do we mean by that?
Well, the new normal describes the way that our everyday lives change following a crisis. Now, of course, today it's how life has changed since the COVID outbreak. Daily routines are different and situations have changed.
So let's talk about some examples, Richard.
Football.
Football.
Yes. Well, you said the other day, each team can now have 5 substitutes and not the traditional 3.
Yes. So what's all that about?
Well, it was introduced during the pandemic because of health issues. But now the Premier League teams have voted to keep it. They say that matches are very intense, the schedule is very tight, and they want to protect their players' health and welfare.
Yeah, well, it certainly benefits the bigger teams who have got bigger squads. But also, Richard, I've noticed on the television, when the footballers are interviewed, in general, there is more distance, isn't there, between the interviewer and the interviewee?
Yes, and not just in football, is it? People seem to stand much further apart than before when they're doing interviews. So you think social distancing, to some extent, is the new normal.
Yes, and in fact, keeping to the sports theme, didn't we notice that at the end of the Tour de France? In fact, all 3 major cycling events, right? The winning cyclist at the end of each stage came out onto the podium already holding the little trophy or flowers or whatever they get given. There was no handshaking at all.
No, and certainly no kissing. Everyone was standing well back, and there is much less person-to-person contact.
Yeah. Of course, one huge change that has started during the pandemic and is now considered normal is working from home.
Yes, for us, that has been normal for a long time. But for many people, it was a great opportunity to experiment with working from home. And it has actually remained a popular option for many. For instance, in the UK, 44% of workers currently work remotely in 2023.
But that's almost half.
That's 16% full-time, 28% hybrid working.
Hybrid working?
Well, it means splitting their time between home and the office.
Well, you can see the attraction from both sides. I mean, an employee doesn't have to make the journey to work and they can organise their own time to suit them. You know, a better work-life balance.
Yes, and of course the employer doesn't have to pay the rent for expensive office space. Zoom calls and conference calls have become acceptable. Again, less money spent on travelling and the technology has improved.
I think there are some downsides, of course, Richard. I mean, missing out on working with colleagues. Many of my friends are people I used to work with.
Yeah, we did actually meet at work, didn't we?
That's true.
And another new normal is our eating habits. Many restaurants which were forced to close during the pandemic started a takeaway service. And this trend has continued. There are 10,000 more takeaway and fast food restaurants than 10 years ago, and more than 2,000 even from last year.
Yeah, that's really changed. And of course, teaching, Richard. Schools, including language schools, offered online classes, and many still do.
What about you, the listener? What for you has become the new normal? Is your life now different from before the pandemic? Do let us know. We'd love to hear from you.